Hello, my name's Andrew Prescott. I was the founding director of the Centre for Research into Freemasonry at the University of Sheffield, which was the first academic centre to be established in a British university devoted to the study of the history of Freemasonry. I now teach at the University of Glasgow. It's a great honour for me to be asked to contribute to this remarkable initiative by the Grand Lodge of Indiana, and I would like to thank the Grand Lodge and in particular Albert McClelland for their great energy and initiative in developing this worldwide exemplification of Freemasonry. The subject of my contribution to this series is the early history of Freemasonry, a subject which is of enormous interest to Freemasons. The question, where does Freemasonry come from, has, since 1717, been a subject of passionate concern to almost every Freemason. There remain a mass of competing views and theories, and this question has dominated research into Freemasonry. I've suggested elsewhere that this obsessive devotion to what the French historian Marc Bloch called the idol of origins has profoundly distorted the historiography of Freemasonry and has led to a neglect of its more recent history. But nevertheless, it's a question that will not go away, so it's one I'd like to revisit in our talk today. English Freemasons, consulting that imposing new reference work, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, to find out more about the origins of Freemasonry, will perhaps be surprised to find that, in the view of the Oxford University Press at least, the problem has been solved. There you will find that William Shaw, the master of the King's works of James VI of Scotland from 1583 to 1602, is described as a founder of Freemasonry. Other authoritative reference works, such as the Oxford Companion to British History, also describe Freemasonry as a social organisation which was essentially created by Shaw in Scotland at the beginning of the 17th century. These views on the origins of Freemasonry derive from the researches of the eminent historian of Scotland, David Stevenson, who was the author of the entry on Shaw in the new Dictionary of National Biography. Stevenson described in his book, The Origins of Freemasonry, Scotland Centuries 1590 to 1710, how Shaw, in two sets of statutes issued in 1598 and 1599 in his capacity as Master of the King's Works and General Warden of the Craft of Stonemasons in Scotland, reorganised the Scottish stonemasons. Previously, the stonemasons had met together informally in lodges set up for particular building projects. Shaw established permanent lodges for particular towns which were removed from the borough jurisdiction and placed under Shaw's direct control. These lodges started to keep regular minutes in which the initiation of entered apprentices and fellow crafts is recorded. Shaw encouraged members of the lodges to take an interest in the latest philosophical and esoteric movements, such as aspects of Rosicrucian thought. These new lodges attracted interest from men who were not working stonemasons, and intellectuals like Sir Robert Moray joined Scottish Masonic lodges and enthusiastically incorporated imagery drawn from the craft and legends of stonemasons in their own philosophy. Eventually, these gentlemen masons were to dominate the membership of the Scottish Masonic lodges, so that their roots in the 16th century craft would almost be forgotten. In Stevenson's view, the ideologues of the early years of English Grand Lodge Freemasonry, such as John Theophilus Desaguliers, were profoundly influenced by Scottish precedents, a contribution reflected in the choice of the Scottish clergyman James Anderson to compile the Grand Lodge's first printed book of constitutions. The evidence assembled by Stevenson is very imposing, and it's not surprising that his views have generally been accepted by academic historians, but on the whole they have failed to find favour with English Masonic scholars. To some extent, this appears to be an issue of definitions. The assumption of English Masonic commentators appears to be that Scottish Freemasonry of the 17th century was entirely concerned with trade organisation and lacked the philosophical dimension which is so evident in 18th century English Freemasonry. This, however, appears to be a rather dismissive view of the highly speculative concerns of men like Moray, and overlooks such Scottish references to esoteric traditions as the claim in the 1658 indenture of the Lodgers' Schoon that the Uniform Community and Union of Stonemasons had its origins in the building of Solomon's Temple, the Temple of Temples as it was described. Stevenson's fundamental argument has generally not been addressed by English Masonic scholars who are simply unwilling to accept a Scottish origin for Freemasonry. Stevenson points out that in Scotland there's continuous and extensive documentary evidence for the operation of recognisably Masonic lodges from 1599. In England during the 17th century we have only fragmentary references, such as the celebrated notes of the initiation of Elias Ashmole at Warrington and Randall Holme at Chester. However, there is one major body of documentary evidence for 17th century English Freemasonry. These are the copies of Masonic legends known as the Old Charges. Insofar as these old charges provide direct evidence of legends circulating among craftsmen from the 15th to the 18th centuries, these are among the most extraordinary and fascinating historical documents of the pre-modern period. The oldest of these documents are the two 15th century manuscripts in the British Library known as the Regius and the Cook manuscripts. More than 20 manuscripts compiled between 1583 and 1717 have been identified whose contents ultimately derive from these medieval exemplars, and these charges continued frequently to be copied after 1717, so that altogether more than 120 versions have so far been traced. These documents originate from England, although, as Stevenson stresses, they were also known in Scotland by at least 1600 and circulated separately there. They represent a substantial documentary corpus, and if we want to find out how the situation in England in the 17th century compared with that in Scotland, we need to start with the Old Charges. Yet the manuscripts of the Old Charges have excited little enthusiasm among modern Masonic scholars. While some scholars such as Wallace MacLeod have looked at the textual relationships of the Old Charges, there has been very little recent work on the dating and localization of these manuscripts. The heroic days of work on these manuscripts was before the First World War, when W.J. Hewen in particular made a systematic search for pre-1717 manuscripts relating to Freemasonry. Virtually every week in the 1880s and 1890s, the Masonic newspaper The Freemason carried news of yet another manuscript of the Old Charges or an ancient Masonic Scottish record identified by Hewen. Since Hewen's time, this impetus has been lost, and we remain very dependent on Hewen's work. This is surprising, since there are still many exciting discoveries to be made. David Stevenson has recently identified in the Bodleian Library a previously unknown copy of the Old Charges dating from 1666. Moreover, a number of other ordinances and regulations relating to stonemasons survive. There are, for example, in the National Archives in London, quote, certain ordinances made by the Treasurer and Controller of the town of Calais and marches of the same concerning carpenters and masons, dating from 1474 to 5, which refer to the maintenance of common funds, known as St. John's Box, by the Fellowship of Craftsmen. Likewise, Gerard Delmans has recently published in Toth, the Dutch Masonic Research Journal, a transcript and facsimile of ordinances of a guild of stonemasons in Maastricht, written down in the 16th century, but said to incorporate regulations dating back to circa 1400. While these ordinances from Calais and Maastricht are not textually related to the tradition stemming from Regius and Cook, and are thus not strictly speaking Old Charges, they are nevertheless vital evidence of the forms of organisation adopted by groups of working stonemasons in the Middle Ages, and thus essential in understanding the context from which the Old Charge tradition emerged. Not only are there important new documentary discoveries to be made, but the fact that there has been little recent scholarly work on the Old Charge manuscripts means that many of the most widely held assumptions about these manuscripts are out of date and should be discarded. For example, it's been assumed since the time of Hume that the copy of the old charges in the British Library Lansdowne Manuscript 98 dates from about 1600, because it occurs in a volume of papers said to be connected with Elizabeth I's Secretary of State and Treasurer, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. However, the manuscript also contains some much later papers, and it's clear from the handwriting that this copy of the old charges dates from the end, not the beginning, of the 17th century. Significant difference. Likewise, the Regius manuscript has generally been dated to circa 1390. However, this dating is dependent on opinions given by the Venerable David Casley before 1730 and James Halliwell in 1839, long before the modern study of paleography had begun. In fact, it seems that the Regius manuscript should be ascribed instead to the second quarter of the 15th century. Such a view of Regius's dating is supported by other texts incorporated in it. There's clearly a need for a detailed new study of the old charge manuscripts. It's not possible to present such an analysis here, but I would like to suggest that some lines of interpretation that might be pursued in looking in more depth at these old charge manuscripts by focusing on just one aspect of their texts, and that's the origins of what has been called the York legend. From the medieval period, stonemasons claimed that they'd been given a charter by the Anglo-Saxon King Athelstan, who reigned from 924 to 939, which permitted them to hold an assembly. As this legend developed, it was claimed that Athelstan's charter was obtained through the mediation of his son, and in some later versions his brother, Edwin. Edwin was said to have convened such an assembly at York, at which he gave ordinances to the stonemasons. A date has been ascribed to the York Assembly of 926. In considering the origins of this story of Athelstan's charter and the assembly at York, it's necessary first to consider the relationship between the Regius and the Cook manuscripts. Both Regius and Cook date from the 15th century. Their dating largely depends on the analysis of the handwriting, which is always an inexact science, but comparison with other manuscripts suggests a date for Regius of the second quarter of the 15th century and for Cook the middle of the 15th century. In other words, they are not very far separated in date, with Regius perhaps slightly earlier. Both are in Middle English, with Regius in verse. Recent analysis of the dialect of Regius has indicated that it was compiled in Shropshire. The language of Cook cannot be so precisely located, but it probably also comes from the West Midlands. It has been assumed that stonemasons were unlikely to have compiled either manuscript, since they were thought to be illiterate, but recent work on lay literacy has stressed that many urban craftsmen were in fact literate in English. According to one estimate, half of the male inhabitants of late 15th century London could read English. In 1417, the stonemason John Clifford of Southwark, who had been master of the London Masons' Company in 1386, left to the church of St. Olave Southwark his principal psalter and another book of Gospels in English for use in the church. In this context, it seems probable that Regius and Cook were made for and used by working stonemasons. It's also previously been assumed that, although Cook was written after Regius, it incorporates an older form of the text. This seems difficult to sustain from a close reading of the texts. Both manuscripts start with a legendary history of the craft of stonemasonry. In Regius, it is claimed that stonemasonry was invented by Euclid to provide employment for sons of the nobility of ancient Egypt. In Cook, this account of the antiquity of the craft has been extended back beyond Egypt to biblical times, with the origins of the craft placed in the pre-flood era during Cain's lifetime. The legendary history in Cook reads very much like an attempt to claim both an even greater antiquity from the craft than that claimed in Regius, and also to demonstrate a biblical origin. The way in which Cook is an elaboration of Regius is particularly evident from comparing their accounts of the history of stonemasonry in England. According to Regius, the craft, having been invented by Euclid, spread from land to land, coming eventually to England in time of good King Athelstan's day. Regius claimed that Athelstan summoned every mason from across his realm to meet with his nobles in a great assembly, where ordinances were made to regulate the craft of masonry and to protect the status of masons. The poem claims that these regulations consisted of 15 articles and 15 points, which it then recites. These articles and points comprise detailed regulations on the pay and working conditions of masons. There is a particular emphasis on the fair treatment of apprentices, and a number of specific restrictions on the actions of masters, who are prohibited, for example, from poaching work or undertaking work which they cannot finish. An annual assembly was established as the governing body of the craft, with responsibility for the enforcement of Athelstan's ordinances. In Cook, the history of English masonry has been hugely expanded. Cook introduces an elaborate story to explain the spread of the craft into France. It then pushes back the story of the introduction of the craft into England to the earliest days of Christianity in Britain. It claims that the Roman martyr St. Albans was the first to make regulations for the trade. Cook emphasises that St. Alban enjoined that masons should be well paid for their work. Moreover, in describing Athelstan's grant to the masons, Cook suggests that rather than being the first such king to make such a grant, he was acting in accordance with precedents set by many other kings dating back to Nimrod. Cook also introduces, for the first time, the figure of Athelstan's supposed son. Cook states that Athelstan's youngest son loved the masons and understood their craft. This unnamed son became a mason himself, gave them charges, and ordained that they should have reasonable pay. He also purchased a patent from his father to allow the masons to hold an assembly. The regulations for masonry made by Edwin are then repeated. If Cook is read, as it apparently should be, as having been composed after Regius, it can be seen as elaborating the legendary history of stonemasonry in order to strengthen the claims of stonemasons. The central character of these claims is clear, that the masons should have reasonable pay and that they should be permitted to hold an annual assembly. In Regius it is claimed that these demands were warranted by the Charter of Athelstan. In Cook, the first regulation that masons should be properly paid is extended back to the time of St. Alban, and Athelstan is presented as confirming these ancient provisions and authorising the assembly. Why then is the figure of Athelstan's son introduced? Almost certainly because the author of Cook was anxious to claim another royal Freemason, and also to more firmly establish the right of masons to hold their own assembly. In Regius, the assembly held by Athelstan consisted of the king and many noblemen. In Cook, the introduction of the figure of Athelstan's son, who becomes a mason, changes the character of the assembly. It becomes an assembly held by masons for their own regulation. In other words, the introduction of a king's son is designed to establish the right of stonemasons to meet together and regulate their craft. Stonemasonry becomes both a royal art and self-regulating. Masonic historians since the time of Gould have harboured a sneaking hope that the stories in Regius and Cook perhaps embody an ancient oral tradition among stonemasons, and that there might be a germ of truth somewhere in those legendary stories. Unfortunately, it's difficult to sustain such a point of view, confronted with the evident manipulation and elaboration of the stories between Regius and Cook. Clearly, the stonemasons were seeking to claim greater and greater antiquity for their right to meet together to ask for better wages. We don't have to look very far to find the reasons for this. Since 1351, legislation had been introduced to control wages in the wake of labour shortages produced by the Black Death. The prosecutions undertaken under these statutes show that the pressure for higher wages was particularly acute in all the building trades. Legislation continued to be introduced in a vain attempt to keep a lid on wages throughout the 15th century. In the 1425 Parliament, the Commons presented a petition complaining that the annual congregations and confederacies made by the Masons in their general chapters and assemblies were publicly violating and undermining the statutes of labourers. The Commons asked King Henry VI and the Lords to ordain that the holding and gathering of such chapters should be utterly forbidden and judged a felony, and requested that the justices of the peace should be given authority to inquire into these chapters and assemblies. King Henry replied that such chapters and congregations indeed should not be held, and declared that those who convened such chapters should be adjudged felons. Any Masons who attended such congregations should be imprisoned without fine or ransom at the King's will. A statute to this effect was duly enacted. The stories in Regius and Cook were intended to authorise the continued holding of such assemblies, notwithstanding the statutory provision. It's probable that the assemblies to which the statute refers consisted of wage-earning journeyman masons who'd completed their apprenticeship but were not yet masters. The stress of Regius and Cook on the social equality of masons and the claim that the craft was of noble origin were both apparently a reaction to the rise of a distinct group of masters. It was for this reason that both Regius and Cook insisted, almost certainly unsuccessfully, that master masons were obliged to attend the assemblies. Regius and Cook, then, are probably manuscripts compiled by gatherings of junior stonemasons held in Shropshire and elsewhere in the west of England to authorise the holding of gatherings which sought to improve their wages and conditions. The wages of building workers continued to be a prominent concern of labour legislation up to the early 16th century. An Act of 1444-5 decreed that Freemasons and master carpenters were to take no more than 5.5 pence a day when feeding themselves, while the wages of all other building workers were not to exceed 4.5 pence a day. This suggests that Freemasons, originally carvers in freestone, were acting as an elite within the trade, a trend also apparent from legal cases of the period. However, the position of the Freemasons was tenuous. An Act of 1495 stipulated that Freemasons were to be paid the same as other building workers, namely no more than 6 pence a day when feeding themselves, with the only exception being master carpenters and masons who were in charge of more than 6 men. These wage rates were repeated in legislation until the middle of the 16th century, when steep price rises meant that such wage levels became increasingly unrealistic. It is no coincidence that it's only after building workers began to agitate once more for better wages in the second half of the 16th century that manuscripts of the old charges start appearing once again, and it really seems that the appearance of manuscripts of the old charges is closely linked to the agitation by building workers for improvement in their wages and conditions. The next oldest surviving manuscript of the old charges after Regius and Cook is in the Library and Museum of Freemasonry in London, and it's Grand Lodge manuscript number 1, whose purchase by Grand Lodge in 1839 was facilitated by Robert Crucifix. This manuscript is dated 25th of December 1583, just 4 days after the appointment of William Shaw as Master of the King's Works in Scotland. Whether or not this is simply a coincidence is impossible to say, but it's very tempting to link the sudden appearance of a new manuscript of the old charges with William Shaw's appearance. Grand Lodge Manuscript 1 represents a substantial elaboration of the medieval legendary history of Masonry as presented in Regius and Cook. For example, it extends in a very unlikely way the story of St Alban's connection with Masonry. It claims that England lacked any charge of masonry until St Alban's time, when the King of England, who was a pagan, built a wall around the town that is now called St Albans. The manuscript states that St Alban was a worthy knight and a steward of the king's household, who governed the realm and the town walls and, quote, loved masons well. Grand Lodge Manuscript 1 claims that St Alban ordained that masons should receive 2 and 6 a week for their work and 3 a day for food and drink. He's also supposed to have given the masons a charter authorizing them to hold a general council. According to the manuscript, after the time of St Alban came divers wars until the reign of Athelstan. Grand Lodge Manuscript 1 adds 2 components to the story of Athelstan and his son as found in Cook, namely the statement that Athelstan's son was Edwin and that he had held an assembly of the masons at York. Moreover, Grand Lodge Manuscript number 1 gives a detailed description of Edwin's alleged proceedings at York. Again, these appear to be designed to improve the narrative's consistency and the credibility of the story, and to enhance the authority of the supposed charges. The author of the Cook manuscript had claimed that various charges had been promulgated by Nimrod, David, Solomon, Euclid, King Charles of France, and so on, which had survived. Grand Lodge Manuscript 1 accounts for the lack of any manuscripts of these charges by stating that Edwin in the assembly at York had subsumed them all into his own charges. The first datable appearance of the York legend in its fullest form, with Athelstan's son identified as Edwin and his assembly of masons placed in York, thus occurs in 1583. However, there is evidence of an intermediary text between Cook and Grand Lodge Manuscript 1. A group of manuscripts, including for example the William Watson manuscript copied in York in 1687, apparently preserve an earlier state of the text than Grand Lodge Manuscript 1. They retain the spurious references to medieval authorities such as the Polychronicon and Isidore of Seville, which are a feature of the Cook manuscript but are expunged in Grand Lodge Manuscript 1. William Watson and the other manuscripts present the story of St Alban and the York legend in much the same form as Grand Lodge Manuscript 1, but add an additional claim that these charges had been seen and approved by Henry VI and his council. These manuscripts also make the surprising and wrong claim that Edwin succeeded Athelstan as king. The garbled information about Edwin in this text indicates that the manuscript is not, as it claims, a reliable copy of a 15th century document. It seems rather that the reference to Henry VI was introduced to counter any suggestion that the meetings of stonemasons had been outlawed by his parliament. The York legend thus appears in its full form sometime between 1450 and 1583. The spurious introduction of Henry VI indicates that it emerged sometime after 1471 and probably sometime in the middle of the 16th century. This suggests an evident context for its emergence. From the middle of the 16th century, there was renewed pressure for increased rates of pay for building workers. While in southern England wages for building workers were allowed to rise, in northern England more vigorous attempts were made to control wages. In his recent book on building workers in the north of England, Men at Work, Douglas Woodward has described how the council in the north put pressure on local authorities in towns such as Hull, Beverley, Chester and York to prevent wages to building workers exceeding the statutory levels. In York, matters came to a head in 1552 when building workers refused to obey the city council's ordinance that they should work for 6pence a day and went on strike. The leaders submitted an eloquent plea that all things are so dear and out of the way that we are not able to work for that wage unless we should be forced and constrained to be run out of the city, or else our wives and children to go on begging forever. The city council refused to accept these pleas, and the leaders of the strike were imprisoned. These protests were echoed across the north of England. In 1560, the council in the north wrote to the mayor and aldermen in Hull expressing its concern that "we be informed there is much disorder within our town of Kingston upon Hull by labourers, artificers and other workmen against our laws and statutes." By contrast, in southern England, the Privy Council allowed building workers to receive much higher wages. As Woodward puts it, it's clear that the government adopted a two-pronged strategy, attempting to enforce a rigid policy in the north, insisting upon the implementation of the Maxima of 1514, but experimenting with a more conciliatory and flexible approach in the South and Midlands. The mid-16th century elaboration of the York legend, with its identification of Athelstan's son as Edwin and the place of assembly specified as York, is evidently a reflection of these attempts to enforce more rigorously labour legislation in the north of England. Most of the surviving 17th century English copies of the old charges can be linked with northern England, and a number derived from York. It's obvious why York would have been chosen as the seat of the assembly, and the old legend that the minster was founded by the Northumbrian king called Edwin made this a natural choice of name for Athelstan's son. But perhaps the most telling details are the wages which these versions of the old charges specify as having been set by St Alban, namely 2 and 6 a week for work and 3d a day for food and drink. Assuming a 6-day week, this works out as 5d a day for work and 3d a day for refreshment. In 1552, the York strikers specified the customary rates as 5d a day with food and drink and 8d a day without. In other words, the wages said to have been customary in Grand Lodge manuscript number 1, in the William Watson manuscript and elsewhere are exactly the same as those demanded by the strikers in 1552. The labour disputes of the mid-16th century led eventually to a major overhaul of the system for regulating wages with the 1563 Statute of Artificers, which gave local JPs the responsibility for determining wage assessments. In York, this power was vested in the mayor and aldermen, which immediately raised the rates payable, establishing a maximum rate of 10d a day without meat for the freemason or master carpenter in charge of works, with at least 3 men working under them. Although this settled labour disputes, copies of the old charges repeating the legendary history in the form which had emerged in York in the middle of the 16th century, nevertheless continued to circulate. Why should these copies of the old charges continue to circulate when there was less pressure on the wages front by building workers? A detailed explanation requires a much closer examination of the individual manuscripts, and this is a major desideratum of future research, but it's evident that, as was the case with Elias Ashmole in 1646, copies of the old charges were used when individuals were initiated into ad hoc gatherings of stonemasons. Moreover, the case of Ashmole is not exceptional, and he was just one of many non-working stonemasons who were initiated into such lodges in the course of the 17th century. For example, Edward Thompson, who died in 1701 and who copied the William Watson manuscript of the old charges in 1687, was a merchant who'd served as Lord Mayor of York in 1688 and was MP for the city in 1688 and 1700. If we see the emergence of the old charges as linked to agitation by building workers for better wages in the middle of the 16th century, why then are these aldermen and other well-to-do townsfolk becoming involved in associations of Freemasons during the 17th century? At one level, of course, this may reflect the influence of development in Scotland, where, in order to bolster funds and membership, Masons' lodges were admitting non-Masons from other crafts who had an interest in the craft and skills of the Masons. The example of individuals such as Moray doubtless encouraged members of the English intelligentsia to take an interest in the stonemasons' history and organisations. It's likely, however, that more local considerations were chiefly responsible for men like the wealthy Edward Thompson in York becoming Freemasons. Although the system of wage regulation introduced by the Statute of Artificers had taken most of the heat out of the situation, there was, as Woodward points out, a quickening of interest in wage regulation in the middle of the 17th century, and in both York and Chester there were further attempts to set wage levels below the market rate. Significantly, both these towns were to have lodges with a considerable non-operative membership shortly afterwards. Clearly, it was judicious for the stonemasons to encourage the local justices of the peace, who controlled their wages, to be aware of the legendary history of their craft and their claims that St. Alban had said that they should be well paid and that Anglo-Saxon kings had authorized them to meet together. A good way of doing this was for stonemasons to encourage city councillors and other prominent townsfolk to join their lodges and to make the legendary history a prominent part of their proceedings, and it seems that this is precisely what happened. The fact that wages remained at the heart of the York legend is reflected in the way that later copies of the old charges increased the wage level allegedly set by St. Albans to 3 and 6pence a week, reflecting wage inflation during the 17th century. The lead on agitating for better wages for building workers had been taken in the 16th century by the North, but the system of assessment established in 1563 applied across the whole country, and from 1630 references occur in the records of the London Company of Freemasons to a body known as the Exception. This was clearly a distinct and elite group within the company, the names of whose members were recorded on boards displayed in the company's hall. Again, non-working masons such as Elias Ashmole paid handsomely to join this group, which paraded separately under its own banner. The Exception owned at least one copy of the old charges, and it seems to have functioned both as an elite social gathering and as a means of increasing awareness of the special craft claims of the Masons among the city's elite and elsewhere. The Exception died out shortly after the London Company of Masons was formally incorporated in 1677. The extent to which the demise of the Exception was related to changes consequent upon this incorporation, or whether it was due to James II's attacks on the rights of city companies, is not clear. It is striking that at the time of its incorporation, the name of the company was changed from the Company of Freemasons to the Company of Masons. So up to 1677, the London Company was generally known as Freemasons. After 1677, it became the Company of Masons. And it's tempting to assume that the revival which took place with the foundation of Grand Lodge in 1717 was in effect a revival of the Exception. It was a revival of a body which had been active up until the late 1670s. The development of the York legend thus spread over a period of about 300 years from circa 1430 to 1738. However, in tracing the gradual articulation of the legend, we can also get an enormous insight into the various factors which ultimately resulted in the first meeting of the English Grand Lodge in the Goose and Gridiron in 1717. Above all, in tracing the development of the York legend, we can see how the organisations formed by stonemasons changed substantially in character over this long period of time. Nor did these changes stop after 1717. The body which met in 1717 was still very different to modern Freemasonry. The infusion of scientific and philosophical interest which the new Grand Lodge received soon after its formation from men like Desaguliers again utterly transformed its character. It was to change radically again in the period of the French Revolution and again in the second half of the 19th century. Freemasonry as we have it today irrevocably bears the hallmark of all these historical processes. This is another reason why the obsessive search for the idol of the origins of Freemasonry has distorted our understanding of both Freemasonry and its historical development. The assumption has been that there is a single point of origin of Freemasonry, and that, if we could but find that point, we would immediately understand its inner truth. But there is no such point. Freemasonry is part of history, and like all institutions, it changes in time. It's that process of constant flux and change that we must devote ourselves to study. Thank you very much for your attention.